Hey there, it's time to talk a little farm, and today we get into it on health, your health, and where it intersects with how our animals are raised. This one's not so much about the food you eat. So whether you eat meat in particular or not, this is super important. It's also, as with all other issues relating to farming, an area where you can have an impact by using your dollars and your voice, plain and simple. I am excited about this season of episodes. I will admit that it's hard to keep up with episodes for 52 weeks out of a year with everything else that I have going on. Running the For Farmers movement, writing a book, sharing farmer stories on social media, writing articles, and working to spread the word about the For Farmers movement and how we need to support our farmers as a guest on various other podcasts. But I love interviewing farmers and other experts in the farming space to inform myself and you about what's going on the front lines of our food production, where our health, environment, economies, and communities intersect. If you are interested in supporting the show, here are 2 ways that you can do that won't cost you a penny and will have a big impact. I'm all about that. First, you can share the show with a friend. I'm sure that they are smart enough to pick an episode that they will be interested in. But if you are really juiced about a particular episode, then that one. You can do it right from the app you're listening in. The other way is to write a review on Apple or Spotify. I will admit to not banging the drum on this for a while, but when you do write a review, it makes me feel really good, and other people might read it and listen because of you. I thank you in advance. All right, now here we are. Welcome to Talk Farm to Me. I am your host since 2019, DiPrima. Today, we get to hang out with Steve Roach from FACT. He has a master's in anthropology, served in the Peace Corps in Southern Africa, and has worked on farms and on-farm programs addressing, for example, the transition of laying hens to cage-free status in the early 90s. It was a tough job liaising between the farmers and the retailers who were getting more cracked eggs than with caged hens. Transitions in the food space are complicated and take time. It's good to keep that in mind. Steve is the Safe and Healthy Food Program Director at FACT, a Chicago-based nonprofit that works on issues around animal agriculture. FACT stands for Food Animal Concerns Trust. FACT has 2 programs, the Humane Farming Program and the Safe and Healthy Food Program that Steve directs. Let's dive in.
So in the Humane Farming Program, we have a grant program where we've given out 608 grants since 2012. We have a mentorship program along with that, and then we do some other educational stuff, webinars and conference scholarships. And so then the program that I'm in charge of is our Safe and Healthy Food Program, which kind of looks more at policy and how can we reduce some of the impacts, negative impacts of animal agriculture on human health. And so while the Humane Farming Program is mainly looking at small diversified farmers, a lot of my work is kind of more targeted towards large confinement animal operations.
I think everybody is interested and concerned about reducing negative impacts on human health from agriculture. Tell me how you are working on that.
So one of the human health impacts that we spend a whole lot of time on is antibiotic resistance. So in the U.S. each year, about 162,000 people, or 1 person every 3.5 minutes, dies from a resistant infection. Antibiotic-resistant infections occur because of antibiotic overuse. So it's both on the human side. So if you're overusing antibiotics, you go to a doctor and you demand antibiotics yourself. That's not good if you have a viral infection. It won't help you and it'll create this problem. But most of the antibiotics used in the United States aren't going to treat sick people. 2/3 of them, about 2/3, a little bit less, are going into animal agriculture. And so what we're concerned about is when we're feeding antibiotics to animals, not to treat sick animals, we've always supported that, but to basically prevent diseases in animals because you're doing something that's likely to end up with them getting sick.
So where is the biggest risk in terms of animal agriculture? I think the labels are confusing where it says no antibiotics, but there are never antibiotics in that industry. And then there are other ones where there are. And I think consumers are just like, what is going on? Tell me where the big problems are.
Where we would say we have the biggest problems with antibiotic overuse is in the pig and the cattle industries, particularly in the large scale with the CAFOS, either the big feedlots or the large pig operations. Because in those systems, you have lots of animals quite together and you're pushing them quite hard so that we get them through the system to slaughter much more quickly. And what that does is it stresses them. We wean baby pigs too early. In the feedlots, we're giving them high energy diets and it causes liver abscesses. So what do they do in the feedlot? For a couple months, 6 months, the whole time they're on feed, they're giving them an antibiotic in that feed. And all of these things are contributing to the problem of antibiotic resistance. The poultry industry has managed to greatly reduce it. And so if you look at the amount they're using in chickens, it's drastically less than in beef and pork production. But part of that also is because, a chicken is only, 32 days as opposed to, a couple years for a beef cow. So
is that really it, that they've just figured out how to manage with less antibiotics or no antibiotics in chicken because of the lifespan? Or are there other factors that are improved?
I think it is easier in chickens in confinement than to raise cattle, because cattle really are pasture animals. They're basically designed to graze and eat grass. But if we have them grazing and eating grass, then it takes them a lot longer to put on weight. And, and people like the marbling you get from feeding the grains. So that's kind of where the difference is we've created this system that really has been created since the 50s where we had easy access to the antibiotics. And so we created a system that depended on them. If you look at the dairy production, there's much less antibiotics used there than in beef cattle. And part of that's because we're harvesting, you're milking all the time. So you can't be constantly administering the antibiotics. So that system developed without that same extent of antibiotic use. And you see both of them. But to some extent, I blame the Food and Drug Administration for kind of allowing this, because they approve all the drugs and say it's safe. And so if they say it's safe, a producer's going to say, well, the government tells me it's okay to use this, so I'll go ahead and do it. And I think that's been a big part of creating this problem.
And so why do you think the FDA is putting approval on this? Because you've obviously got a point that if antibiotics are making these, these superbugs that are resistant, then that's got to be a problem on their radar screen, right?
Yeah, it's definitely on the radar screen, and they have taken some steps to address it. In 2017, they stopped allowing the use of the medically important ones for growth promotion. So those are those feed efficiency, where you're not even trying to do anything medical. You're just, improving your productivity. So, and that caused a drop. But since then, we've been creeping back up. And the other thing they required was a veterinary oversight for the drugs used in feed and water. And then just starting last month, the rest of the drugs, some of the injectables that you could buy over the counter, you can't do anymore. So I think that was a good step. But the problem is those drugs, we can't use them any longer for growth promotion. But many of the same drugs, you can still use them for very long periods in food animals to prevent diseases. You don't have to have any signs of illness, but you can still use them. And I think that's where the big bulk is. And that's really where we've asked people to stop doing it, using those. So we always talk about don't routinely use antibiotics. So that would be at time of weaning, don't automatically put all of your animals on antibiotics. And not everybody does that, and there's a lot of variation. But obviously, if you compare what we're doing in the U.S. to some of the countries in Europe where they've been trying to reduce them out, we're using 5 times as much antibiotics to raise a cow in the U.S. as in the U.K. And that just isn't necessary.
So give me a comparison. Are we tracking how our animals and their health is compared to the animals in the UK?
I think there's not great information. And I think to some extent in the UK, they aren't using the feedlot system that we have here in the US. And their production is a lot smaller. So I think there are differences. The calves come off of these small cow-calf operations, where they're on small ones. And those guys don't really use that much antibiotics generally. And then they may go to a sale barn where you're mixing baby calves together and they've just been taken from the mother, so they're young, their immune system's not great. And then you ship them to the feedlot out in the Great Plains. And that's stressful, and we do get a lot of respiratory disease. There's two big reasons in the cattle. That was respiratory disease for these calves that come in, high-risk cattle, they call them. So they will inject them all, often then give them feed antibiotics for 2 to 3 weeks. And then, because of, again, the diet on the feedlot, they give them antibiotic Tylus, and they'll put it in all of the feed. And that'll be then for the rest of the time on the feedlot. So that system is kind of what is creating it. What we're really trying to promote is how do we keep beef cattle on pasture longer? And that's the challenge. Some of the people trying to do regenerative grazing. Can we do more to keep them on that pasture longer? Manage those pastures better so that you can keep them there on that farm. But, there's a challenge because a lot of the cow-calf operators, it's really a part-time thing. They have their job in town to make money, and they're not want to doing this kind of intensive focusing on the cow-calf. And so I think that's where I see the conundrum, particularly in beef cattle. I see if we could keep animals more on pasture, that would be great. Climate change probably isn't helping, because we have the weird weather and, big droughts, and that makes it hard to do that as well. I see there's a lot of potential for more regenerative grazing systems, kind of addressing some of the drought and the climate, where the strange weather we're having. And so if we could find a way to keep the cattle in pasture longer, then the antibiotics really becomes a non-issue, because you'll treat them, every once in a while they get sick, but you don't need to treat them so routinely.
It is a domino effect of issues, and land is not our problem. Am I correct that we've got plenty of land for these cattle to graze on pasture? What percentage of our beef, for example, are in CAFOS?
I'm trying to remember the numbers, but it's very high. It's probably 90% gets finished. Most of them are on pasture at some point in their life. It's just we finish them over there, but that's like 6 months out of their life. In Iowa, half of our corn ground is just going into ethanol. So we obviously aren't required that land to produce food. And I think what has happened is a lot of lands, like slopey lands, low-lying land that floods, we're putting that into corn and soybeans. And really some of that we need to return to pasture is another way of doing it. And if we do that, we have plenty of land to produce the amount of beef that we want to do. Now, the issue, it will be more expensive. So what my organization talks about, can we get people to eat better meat, but maybe a little bit less? And I know that's a hard sell for some people, but I think that's where we want to go with it.
And what's the rub with other countries and the meat that we're raising here and the antibiotics and the CAFOS? And, they're all different kinds of things that we have as a part of our system that other countries aren't necessarily excited about, or vice versa.
We have a fairly intensive system. I think they're adopting it more in Brazil. It's very similar to ours. So there's some issues around that. I think Australia a little bit is starting to develop more of the feedlot production. JBS is both in the U.S. and in Australia.
JBS is a Brazilian-owned company that is the leading beef producer in the world, with operations in the United States, Australia, and Canada. JBS are the initials of Jose Batista Sobrino, a rancher in Anápolis, Brazil, who founded the company in 1953. JBS has 45 brands in the United States. It's a story for another day.
The Europeans at this point have decided that they want to have, again, that better meat and not so much. And then you can go to China, and I think there we're more talking about pigs. There's just really high intensity system, high levels of antibiotic use. If you look at the research on it, if you want to know how to create superbugs, go look at farms in China, because there are a lot compared to even ourselves. So it's a mixed base, and I think there are some of the African countries, they could probably use more antibiotics because they just don't have adequate healthcare systems for their animals. So it's a very mixed thing. And when you're talking about Africa, in a lot of the countries, the problem isn't the animal use of antibiotics. It's just basic sanitation among people, where you don't have clean water, clean sanitation, and that's a big problem for antibiotic resistance. So we talk about it as a kind of a one health problem. It's kind of like we have to look at human health, we have to look at animal health, We can't ignore the environment because that's another way. If you give antibiotics to the animals, it's going to be in the manure. The antibiotics themselves will be in the manure and the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Then it goes in the water. In where I live in Iowa, up in the Northwest, there's really good cropland, but that means we've also put an awful lot of pigs there. And so that means there's an awful lot of pig manure going out into the environment. And that pig manure will have, as well as the nutrients that, cause problems in our water, it also creates a human health risk.
So the antibiotics in the soil is then causing an issue with the microbiome. So all of the things that we want in our soil to help us grow good grass for cows to eat or to grow good vegetables for us to eat, they're all reduced by antibiotics?
Yeah, that's a kind of an area of new science where we don't understand really well. But yeah, there is some evidence of that. You have weird things where plants will actually uptake. You kind of think of you're giving the antibiotic to the animal. Plants can uptake antibiotics or uptake antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And we really don't understand how these things interact all together. But what we do know is that if you use more antibiotics, you get more resistant bacteria, you get more antibiotics in the environment. And we should all be wanting to, how can we reduce that? And, I've talked a lot about cattle and about weaning baby pigs too early. One of the studies we saw is like even in confinement pigs, if you go from 21 days to 28 days, then you can reduce the amount of animals you need to treat by half.
For what?
For weaning.
Wean them 7 days later.
Yeah, which costs money because you need to have that space for those pigs to grow and they're, on the sow for a little bit longer. But the cost differential isn't very much, but the margins, for a CAFO, the margins aren't great either. So how do we change these systems?
Right. So we've got these, as you say, intensive systems that are pushing animals from birth to slaughter weight very quickly. They're experiencing some serious health side effects as part of that rush, and they are on antibiotics as a matter of course. Now, those are going into our soil. They're going, obviously into our meat, into our soil, into our waterways. And so we're affected sort of systemically by all of this. When I am going to the supermarket to buy meat, or I tend to buy directly from farmers, but when one goes to the supermarket and there's labeling, talk to me about how labeling is helping us or not.
Yeah, so I'm like you, what we do is we buy a half a pig once a year, and that's a large part of the meat in my family. So it's Nettle Valley Farm in Minnesota. We do buy our milk from the local co-op, but I know the farm, it's Radiance Farm in Fairfield. So we actually know where we're getting most of our meat from. But, the alternative is when you go to the grocery store, because I don't think everyone has that opportunity that you and I have. But if you go to the store, just if you want to look at the antibiotics and the raised without antibiotics label or the organic label are ones you can go to. I talked to other people, they're not perfect labels, right? And there's opportunities for cheating. There was a study out by some of my friends at the Antibiotic Resistant Action Center at GW University who were looking at some of the cattle and they're raised without. And some of them were pretty bad because they actually tested for residues of the antibiotics and they found there. But we're actually developing ways to test more so that we can kind of make sure that people are doing what they're saying on this label. And I would say that, for FACT, we are really interested in humane treatment. So if you can find them, we really support animal welfare approved labels, humane certified, the GAP, the certification. We like 4 and 5 or higher. And then American grass-fed certification. So those are what we would say your best bet if you can find them under those certification, if you can't talk to a farmer and ask them what they're doing. But really the best bet is to talk to the farmer, ask, okay, what's your policies on using antibiotics? Do your animals get outside? Do your cattle eat grass, or are they just always inside? But if you can't do that, then I think some of these other labels, the certified ones are really good. They all have antibiotic policies as well as the humane treatment. Because another thing we don't want to do is say, just don't give the animals antibiotics when they're sick and not do anything to make sure that they're not getting sick.
I've heard farmers look, feel, and speak in a defensive way when you ask about antibiotics. Essentially like, yes, of course, if our animals are sick, they receive proper treatment, and that sometimes involves antibiotics. And then there's a time period, but we are not feeding them antibiotics. And I think that's something that consumers don't necessarily understand, because I think the nuance gets lost in the headlines.
Yeah, no, because we also have kind of tried to push some of the companies to adopt policies. We always say no routine antibiotics. You have to let them treat the sick animals. But the companies just don't like that. It's so much easier to say no antibiotics ever. And that's where we've struggled a bit. But again, I mentioned before my colleagues over at the Antibiotic Resistant Action Center, and they have developed something called a certified responsible antibiotic use, which allows you to treat the sick animals. It's kind of a different label than that. And it also requires you to keep track. So if you have to treat the animals, you have to tell the certifier. So they can then see if, are you continuously having, and if you have to reuse them, then you have to look and say, is there something we can do to change it? And I think that's a great label. So far, it's been used in chickens and turkeys, and coming soon, they're going to have a beef producer using it. And I'm really happy to see that coming out. I think the farm they're working with is all direct marketing, mainly online. But I think it's great that they've managed to get someone. Now we'd like to find a pig producer, because we haven't found one that would. So in that one, as I said, that allows you to treat sick animals, no problem with that, but you don't use them routinely. And what we're mainly talking about there is the preventive use. So where you're doing something that's going to get your animal sick, so you just start feeding antibiotics beforehand.
And what are the biggest downsides to consuming meat with antibiotics, for example, for a person?
Yeah. So for us, we're mainly concerned about antibiotic-resistant bacteria, so the superbugs. So, if you get a Salmonella or E. coli or Campylobacter, so those are very commonly found on meat products, even, well-raised ones. And you get sick from that, then it becomes much harder to treat those. And then the other kind of terrible thing that bacteria do, is they give their resistance to other bacteria, even different types of bacteria, so they can spread it around. So you may eat something that doesn't make you sick, and E. coli, a lot of meat has E. coli in it. Most of it won't make you sick, but that E. coli might give you its resistance genes to another bacteria in your gut, and then you get sick, and then that makes you sick from that. That's the one thing we're concerned about. And it's not only in the food, it also, as I said, it'll go into the manure and into the water. So if you're swimming if you swim in the Iowa River down here, you could pick up an infection that's hard to treat. Or farm workers are also at risk. So that's something, and farm workers meaning, farm owners or farm workers that are employees. And sometimes employees are not well paid and don't have good access to medicine. So you're giving them resistant infections is a big challenge.
Sounds like a daunting field that you're in, because it sort of touches on everything from breeding to the supermarket. What are the sort of top 3 things that you would change?
We'd like to either have FDA policy change or have companies or meat producers choose not to use antibiotics as disease prevention. So make sure you're preventing disease in your animals by giving them healthy conditions. And, there's a lot of ways you can do that. And I think each farmer and producer would have to think about how they do that. So prevent disease by providing healthy conditions, and don't use antibiotics for disease prevention. So that would be the biggest policy thing we ask for. And in Europe, they actually require everyone to do that starting last year. The second thing is we'd like FDA to actually begin collecting data on farm about how antibiotics are used. So easiest policy we say is collected from feed mills. The feed mills are already required to keep that data for the FDA. If you mix antibiotics into an animal feed, you're actually required to keep data and give it to the FDA when they request it. So we've asked them to request it. And that way you don't have to go to every single farm and ask them what antibiotics are you using. Because I think that's a really giant lift. I don't think we're very close to ever getting there.
So when you're talking about the feed mills, the FDA is asking the feed mills, what farms are you giving this antibiotic feed to?
Yeah, and how much are you putting in? I don't even need them to tell which farms they're giving it to, but what are you putting it in for, and what is it used to treat? The feed mill will have that information because there's the way the rules are written right now.
Let's talk about the big companies, for example, because you were talking about looking for a pig farmer who would be willing to adopt your labeling. So is that the pressure point? Is it the farmer, or is it the company or whomever is taking the pork to bring it to market?
Basically, it has to be the person that's marketing it, right? So it can be the individual farmer if they're doing a lot of direct marketing. And that's kind of the small guys that we work with a lot. They're doing direct marketing, so they can talk about their antibiotic use. But if not, it would have to be a company in adopting policies. That's what we saw in the chicken industry in any case. So basically in the early 2000s, Tyson and Purdue started kind of challenging each other about who could reduce antibiotics more. And what that's done is the whole industry, there's very few that are kind of routinely using antibiotics right now. Of the big guys, all of them are either not using medically important antibiotics or not using any antibiotics at all. I mean, there was some recent news about Tyson, who had a raised without antibiotics label. They're going back to a not medically important antibiotics label. And I'm not exactly sure that, they're thinking on that. But that means they're using just this one class, the ionophores, which we don't use in human medicine, though we are seeing, again, the Europeans doing a lot of study and the Scandinavian are showing it may be creating a problem of resistance for the drugs that we do use. So I'm not a big fan of them going backwards on that, but they're the big companies that make those decisions. And I think for the integrated system, it has to be the integrator because they decide what the farms have to do.
So this is something I'm always looking for because I believe that these big systems can be impacted by consumers. We say we want X and we say it loud enough and often enough, then things change. What can our consumers do? And where do they go in order to do that? Like, what kind of action can consumers take and who do they take it with in order to make changes in this system?
We've talked a little bit about purchasing. And so you can buy the raised without. I'd say from my perspective, avoid buying conventionally raised meat. I mean, that's my perspective and that's FACT's perspective. But then also on, FACT periodically will have people sending materials to companies asking them to make changes. So we do have an activist network. People could sign up for that. On our website, there's a drug called Carbadox that we feed to over half the pigs. It's a known carcinogen. It's actually the only known carcinogen that we're still using as an animal drug. Most of the other ones have been withdrawn. The arsenicals, I don't know, they were around, I think maybe 5 or so years ago. They withdrew all of those because they're carcinogens as well. So we're actually writing to the big food service companies like Sodexo and Haramac and Compass. So we'll have opportunities for people to write to those guys periodically.
I am going to include how to find these resources from FACT in the show notes, including how you can reach out to the FDA. So check that out and sign up for their blog. Big issues in this area, very well explained by experts. I love the idea here, too, of breaking down the solution for us to some of these big problems into bite-sized actions, don't you? Let's review the 3 things quickly here. Number 1, FDA or producers to choose not to use antibiotics in disease prevention. Yes, use them if an animal gets sick, but not to prevent illnesses as you rush them to maturity for slaughter and sale. 2, FDA to request and review data that is already collected at feed mills about how much antibiotics are included in feed and for what purposes. This is a very concrete request. And 3, let's stop using Carbadox, a known carcinogen, to treat more than 50% of our pigs. Seems like a no-brainer, right? FACT has an activist network you can join to sign petitions or to call your representatives. Finally, I wanted Steve to get the last word on what the problem is. There are many, but if there was one pressure point, one place where the problem could be addressed, where the proverbial ostrich could pull her head out of the sand, this would be it.
the biggest thing is we feel there's a failure at the Food and Drug Administration to actually address this problem, and they're a big part of it because they do have this responsibility to make sure the drugs that they approve are safe. And they know these drugs have serious challenges to safety because of the antibiotic resistance, and they're just very slow to respond to that.
Thanks for being here with me today for Talk Farm to Me. Check the show notes for links to FACT, their blog and their activist network if you want to get more involved. I feel good that you and I are more informed about how our meat production could be improved. Remember, please to vote with your dollar to support your local farmers. This is an interesting point of conversation for you at the farmers market. I just think the contrast between pasture-raised pork with factory-raised pork is so astonishing. I try to keep that in mind. Remember what I said at the top of the show? You can support this podcast in 2 easy ways. Share the show or this episode with a friend and leave a review on Apple or Spotify. That would make you my hero. It's the main way that this show has grown to so many dedicated listeners since 2019. I am your host, Dana DiPrima, and this is Talk Farm to Me. See you next week.